My brothers from another mother. So I just finished the Blackstone call with the folks that do the oil analysis, and I had one done on my car a few days ago. I posted a little bit of a Q&A on it, and I took some questions from people, and I asked the guy in the Skype video. So I hope you enjoy this. It's about to come up in a second. The reason why I did the oil analysis on my car is because it has the certified pre-owned warranty to 160,000 kilometers and a dyno tune pushing almost 700 horsepower. So I legitimately wanted to know what kind of state the engine was in, if it's a good motor or not. And of course, if you get a good report, you're going to want to drive the car, and it's something that will probably help you in selling the vehicle. Because a lot of the times, if you're trying to sell an M car and it's got a lot of miles on it, people start to freak out. Mine's got 80,000, which is, I don't know, roughly 40, 50,000 miles, so it's still fairly new. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy the video. I'll link in the low bar to their website if you want to do your own analysis. It's not expensive, and I truly believe in what these guys are doing. Thanks for checking out this one. We'll talk to you guys later. Peace.
What is up, everybody? I'm on with the good folks at Blackstone Labs in the U.S. I've got Travis on. You are the VP of, what do you do there?
I'm one of the senior analysts. We're the ones who will look at the data that comes in your report and write up the summary that you'll get back that kind of explains what all is going on in the report.
Cool. Okay, so the reason why I reached out to them actually was when I still had my E93 M3. You're probably familiar with the S65 motor and the fact that a lot of people criticize it for rod bearing failures. Actually, let's talk about that for a little bit, because that was the first, that was when I first reached out to you, but I was just kind of transitioned over to the M5. So what's up with the S65 and rod bearing failures? Like, do you have a lot of experience seeing motors about to blow or blowing with the oil reports?
I would say we have a lot more people worried about it than we have actually seen it happen. Everybody who sends in a sample from an S65, they're right on the back in the comment section concerned about rod bearing failure, and it's really pretty rare that we actually see a sample from that happening. If we do, we'll see some metals showing up. We'll see things like lead, copper, iron, those sorts of things starting to increase. But as I understand it, it's a failure that happens pretty quickly when it goes, so there's not a lot of warning ahead of time. It's something where if we catch it just at the right time and they take a sample, we may see it, but it seems to be something where, first of all, it's not quite as common as it's made out to be in terms of at least the samples that we've seen of it, and when they do, we see them either before or after that happens, not during the process.
That's actually very interesting, because we did not even talk about this before I hit the record button, and I literally had the same conversation over a year ago, and I basically went through the forums and I was looking at how many rod bearing failures there were versus the number of people that own the cars on the production runs, versus when they would happen to, and I found the same thing. Most of the rod bearing failures on the M3s happened under 30,000 miles. And there was tons of them out there that had well over 200,000 miles on the cars on the original rod bearings that were running strong. So it's fairly heavily overstated from my experience. So I'm kind of glad that you echoed that, because I kind of want to get another one, because I do like those cars.
Yeah.
Okay, so a bit of the history of the company. You guys started in '85. I know that you've got a lot more of a background analyzing oil samples for the aircraft industry, because that would suck if those fell out of the sky. Like heavy engines, diesel engines, stuff like that. So, like, what's the background of the company?
I would say we started out doing industrial machinery, hydraulic fluids, things like conveyor belts and lifts and that sort of thing. That was kind of the bulk of it in the early days, and they focused on going around and getting factories and that sort of thing. Once the internet took off, we kind of expanded out into the other markets, and that's where we get. The aircraft industry is piston engine aircraft. It's much more common for people to get oil analysis. It's part of the routine maintenance for a piston engine aircraft. But the bulk of our customers, I would say, probably 40 to 50% are just normal vehicle owners, cars and trucks who want to check their own engines and see what's going on inside.
And are there a lot of signals and signs towards like potential engine failure?
There are certain things that an oil analysis will pick up really well. Things like bearing failure that we can pick up, with just a few parts per million of metal over the norm. So things like that will, as long as there's some advanced warning and we see a sample at the right time, we can alert you to that before it turns into a major issue. things like cylinder and ring wear, those are other sorts of things. As long as it's from a metal moving part that shares the oil, there's a good chance we'll see some sign of it in the engine. So, I mean, we're not going to see things like an alternator failing because, we're not going to get any evidence of that in the oil. But anything internal to the engine, there's a good chance we'll see some evidence for it. And where we really can save you a lot of money is if we pick up a coolant leak, say with just a few dozen parts per million of sodium and potassium. It might be just hundredths of a percent of coolant in your oil, but the fact that it's there means that there's a leak, and that leak is going to get bigger until you get it taken care of.
Gotcha.
So,
and it's like, just so you guys know from my experience, it's a really easy process. When I had the oil changed, I gave the mechanic it's basically a little bottle, like a sample bottle. Well, actually, he filled up one of my empty clean bottles with it, and then I filled the sample bottle afterwards. But the container that I shipped it to Blackstone in was basically the size of a Rubik's Cube. Do you guys have one there handy by any chance?
It's
not
have
big,
one
but it's like literally the size of a Rubik's Cube. It's a black Rubik's Cube with a screw-on lid. Didn't take long. I think I got I did it over the holidays. I think I shipped it to you just before Christmas. Then I went away for vacation, and I got an email back while I was sitting on the beach. So it was super quick. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide over onto the screen record what my oil report looks like. And you've got a copy there too, right?
I do, yes.
All right, so I've got it up on my screen. They can see it as I'm recording it. You want to just talk about what all these lines mean? Because on the right-hand side, you've got universal averages. On the left-hand side, you've got the details for my specific oil sample, and you've got, let me just see if I can, I can drag my mouse over so you guys can see it. So I've got, it shows about 10,000 kilometers on the oil. I think it had 9,800 kilometers. There's about 78,000 kilometers on the motor. It stamps the sample date, and then it starts going through things like aluminum, chromium, iron, copper, and then on the right-hand side, it's got universal averages. Now, the question that I've got is, for the universal averages column, is that like a median average of all the oil samples you've taken for that particular motor in that mileage range?
It's not affected by the mileage range, but it is all the samples we've seen from an S63 4.4 liter engine. And what we do is we exclude any that are showing obvious problems where things are way out of line. So we get very quickly to what a normal engine of that kind should wear. We figure anything over 10 to a dozen samples, we've got pretty solid averages that aren't going to change much with one or two samples. And then, like I said, anything that comes in where all the metals are just way out of line, we don't include those in the average range. So looking at this particular engine, we've seen a total of about 50 samples, and 37 of those are included in the averages.
Okay, so you exclude the ones with the far left or far right averages. When you say the universal averages, does that include all cars that motor was put in? So X5Ms, X6Ms, M6s, or is it just the M5s?
It's all engines that are all models that use that engine. We found that the engines don't wear very differently across different models. So if the same engine is used with the same architecture, it's going to wear pretty similarly across any type of model it's put in. There are a few exceptions to that in things like Chrysler has some engines that they will include in a Jeep, and then also in a luxury, Chrysler 500 or something like that. And they'll see enough different usage that it's kind of worth separating those out.
Yeah.
But in general, we'd rather have a larger sample size of the engines rather than trying to separate it out by model and have a smaller sample size that may not be as representative.
Makes sense. Gotcha. Okay. So walk me through what all these elements mean. Like, we've got all of these, basic elements, these metal elements. What do they all mean versus the averages?
Well, each element is something that we test for that's either a wear metal from the engine, a contaminant that could be introduced, or some sort of additive that's in the oil itself. We check for 20 different elements, and so the top one is aluminum. Aluminum, typically, the most likely source for aluminum wear to show up in the oil is pistons in most types of engines, but there are also engines with aluminum bearings, engines where it's possible for aluminum to come from the case itself. So it depends heavily on exactly what type of engine it is, what the most likely sources for the metals are. But with aluminum, it's typically the pistons. Chromium, typically we'll see it from the rings before we would see it anywhere else. Iron is usually the dominant metal in any engine. It's from steel parts, so you've got your shafts, your cylinders, your a lot of steel parts throughout the engine, valve train, those sorts of things. So that can have any number of sources. Mm-hmm. Copper, again, bronze parts. So again, there are a lot of options for where that might come from, but typically we'll see it either as a bearing metal or maybe something in the valve train. We'll see it quite a bit when new parts are installed. If there are any bronze bushings or fittings or anything like that, those will wear in, and we'll see high copper for a while. Lead is the big one we watch for bearing wear. That's really the only source for lead in an engine, unless it's an engine that's running leaded fuel. Mm-hmm. Then we'll see just tons of lead, and it won't mean anything. It'll just be there from the fuel. Gotcha. Tin is a trace element that really only shows up when we also have high levels of copper and lead. Beyond that, just a trace will show up here and there. But by itself, it's not usually indicative of much. Molybdenum, it can be a piston coating in some engines, but more often we see it as an oil additive. Your molybdenum disulfate will be used in a lot of different oils. Okay. And it can range anywhere from 50 parts per million, like we have in this report, up to 600, 700 parts per million if it's an additive in the oil. So okay. It just depends on the oil type. The next few elements, nickel, manganese, silver, titanium, potassium, there are not a lot of sources for these in most automotive engines. Some of them are important for aircraft engines and different types of machinery. But those you usually don't see much of any in most automotive engines. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we'll see titanium, like Corvettes have titanium connecting rods and intake valves and those sorts of things that we can see that sort of wear from. Mm-hmm. And silver is an important element in the Subaru WRX STI, because that a few parts per million can show a bearing failure in that type of engine. But
hold on a sec. So I used to have a Subaru a long time ago, like one of the old two Bug-Eye models. Why would they put silver in the engine? That's a very soft metal. Like, where would they use that?
It's a bearing metal, and I'm sure it's not the only bearing metal, but it's one of the few engines where we see where silver is from the bearings, and it only takes a few parts per million of it to really show, to show that there's a bearing failure imminent. Most bearings have a soft metal as the top layer that's meant to be a sacrificial Babbitt layer that will wear away, and then the harder bronze layer underneath. So it's possible that that's where they're using it. We're not 100% sure, but we know when we see silver in that particular type of engine, it's a huge red flag. Okay,
and then you've got some other engine parts, obviously like titanium, and then you're getting into other elements like potassium, calcium. Mm-hmm. Like, motors are not made out of calcium. Like, why would it have 2448 as a reading for calcium? What's that for?
These lower elements are going to be mostly additives in the oil. Mm-hmm. Calcium is usually the dominant detergent additive in most types of oil. Sometimes you'll also see a mix of calcium and magnesium. Phosphorus and zinc are anti-wear additives. Mm-hmm. ZDDP that's out there. If somebody's buying a ZDDP additive and adding it to their engine, we'll see just huge numbers of zinc and phosphorus. Mm-hmm. Potassium and sodium are interesting because there are some harmless sources. Like sodium can be an additive in a lot of types of oil. If you use a Valvoline product or Royal Purple or several other types of oil, you can have a few hundred parts per million of sodium show up. But in most types of oil, there isn't any sodium, and sodium can also be an indicator of antifreeze. So if we see especially sodium and potassium both reading high, that's when we'll be concerned about a coolant leak or some sort of coolant contamination. And silicon is probably the other one that shows up the most. It can be a sign of dirt. So if the air filter is clogged or ripped, or there's a crack in the hoses downstream of the filter, we can get high silicon. That can make the oil abrasive and start causing excess wear. But we'll also see silicon during wear-in from like RTV sealers and that sort of thing. So anytime you do engine work, let us know, because there's a good chance any silicon we see could be from that instead of something harmful.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And then we get into these other properties, things like fuel, antifreeze, and water. That's stuff you don't want in oil, obviously. So you mentioned earlier about the antifreeze component.
Mhm.
That makes sense. And fuel, like fuel will get in the oil how? Through like piston blow-by?
Yeah, well, it's normal to see a little bit of fuel. It's not unusual at all to see a 0.5% or 1% just from normal operation, especially if the engine doesn't get warmed up all the way before the sample is taken.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't burn off the excess fuel from startup, and that just kind of seeps down into the oil. If the engine idles a lot, or those sorts of kind of low RPM operations where the engine just doesn't get hot enough to burn it off.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we advise when you take a sample, you want to take the engine out on the highway for 15 minutes or so, get it nice and warm, then park it, and then take the sample, because that eliminates that kind of incidental fuel. If fuel is very high, if it's 3 or 4%, then we could be looking at things like injector issues, or something wrong in the actual cylinder area, a broken or stuck ring or something like that that's allowing that fuel to seep down into the oil.
Got it. Okay, so for people watching this that might have an M5, let's say, like my car's got 80,000 kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles, like 45, 50,000 miles. So it's still fairly new. What's the highest mileage oil sample you've seen on an S63 motor? Like, is that something that you're aware of?
Yeah, I can. We can always look at what the kind of breakdown of the samples we've seen are, and I can tell you the highest. Let me give you just a second. The highest time on the equipment we've seen from this type of engine is, for this particular one, we've seen engines right around the 100,000 mile mark. So switch that into kilometers, but.
And they wear fairly clean, like.
Yeah,
is
really.
This a strong motor that I should drive for a few more years?
yeah, you should be good for a while.
Yeah.
That'll get you to 160,000 kilometers or so, and that's just the highest one we've seen. It doesn't mean that it broke down right after that.
Gotcha.
Typically we see that if the engine is wearing well, it should wear about the same, whether it's at 30,000 kilometers or 130,000 kilometers. The wear shouldn't change much over time, and if it does start to wear as it gets older, that's an indication that something's going wrong. Parts are wearing out or something like that. So that's why we don't adjust the averages based on the mileage, because they should stay pretty much the same.
Okay, and like how often would you reasonably want to do something like this? Like once every how many miles?
It really depends on the person. Some people do it at every single oil change. Some people do it once a year. It's good to establish a set schedule to do it, so that when we see a sample, we're not looking back and saying, okay, well, we saw a sample 5 years ago that the metals were a little lower, but we don't know what's changed in that time. So obviously from our perspective, the best trends to build are if you sample at every single oil change, because then we'll see every change that's made along the way. But a lot of people don't want to do that, and that's perfectly understandable.
And what's the cost? It's not that much. Like, what's the cost for it?
Right. If you're using a synthetic oil that costs it may cost you $50 or $60 just for the oil to do the oil change anyway. What's the cost of getting it analyzed? But
yeah. What's the actual cost of the person if they were to send it in to you guys? Because I didn't tell them yet.
It's $28 for the standard test.
Yeah.
There are a couple additional things that people might want to tack on depending on their particular interests, but the one in particular for automotive engines is the Tbn test, which is the total base number, and that can tell us how much active additive is remaining in the oil. So if you're looking to run longer on your oil change intervals, that's a good number to get.
So BMW, for example, recommends, like, I don't know, it's ridiculous, something like 15 or 20,000 miles or kilometers between their intervals. Like, how well does the oil maintain its anti-wear capabilities that long into the life cycle? Like, what's that all about? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, typically we see that it's not the oil that wears out. It's a problem in the engine that might keep you from going that long. And what we try and do is, if somebody's routinely changing their oil at, say, 7,000 or 8,000 kilometers, and things look really good, we'll say, well, try and bump it up to, say, 10 or 11,000 next time.
Gotcha.
And if things still look good there, then you can go a little longer. And we don't like to just lay out a blanket statement that, this oil and this engine can run 20,000 kilometers, but we want to see that it's possible, and we need to see that incrementally to see if that can be done.
I'm curious because I mean, like you work at Blackstone, so you see oil samples. I'm guessing you have a gas-driven car. Like, how often do you change your oil?
I probably not as often as I should, to be honest, but but I do pull samples here and there just to make sure that everything is looking right, and that's one of the benefits of working here is I can just bring in a bottle anytime I want.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I can easily. I drive a Chevy Cruze just as my daily driver, and I can easily do 8 to 10,000 miles on it without much problem. Sometimes, depending on my driving habits, the wear gets a little high. But I have a long highway commute to work, so it's fairly easy on the engine.
Yeah, those tend to be. All right, so just one last question. I posted this on my Facebook page for the audience, and I had some questions that came up that I forgot to ask. One guy asked, how small or how large are the particles can your test detect? Because when you're saying parts per million, like, I don't know, like the size of the particle, can you give me an example of?
Yeah. In the spectrometer tests, we're actually looking at microscopic particles that are suspended in the oil itself. So we're talking like 2-3 microns and lower. And the spectrometer actually won't read particles that are big enough to see with the naked eye or to pick up and hold, because it requires a very small amount to be drawn up into the spectrometer to be vaporized to read the numbers.
Okay.
So those larger particles we'll see in like the insolubles test and just looking at the oil physically, but when we talk about the parts per million, that's microscopic particles that are suspended in the oil.
Yeah, one of the things that I used to like to do before I would buy a car is I'd grab the dipstick and just run my fingers across it and just rub it between my fingers. And I mean, you can't do that with many new cars now because they don't have dipsticks, but you can always do that before you send the sample in. All right, man. I really appreciate you taking some time to have a chat today. It's been insightful for me. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Check out Blackstone. Is it blackstonelabs.com or?
Blackstone-labs.com.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll put the URL in the low bar to the video so they can find you guys and order their own kit. The way it worked from my experience is you basically order the kit, they mail it to you for free. You fill it up with your sample, and then you pay when they process the sample, and they email you the report. So it's super easy, very efficient. Highly recommend it. Thanks very much. And
thank you.
Talk to you guys later. Have an amazing day. Bye.
You too. Thanks.